now, David Plouffe, the senior advisor to President Obama. So, you've heard all that we've been talking about. Is there a deal?
No, there's not.
Is there a deal close, a framework? What can you tell us?
Well, I unfortunately can't negotiate here on your program. I think that what's clear is that pretty much both parties agree that there's going to be a first stage of debt reduction, over $1 trillion, that there is going to be a process, as George talked about, a congressional committee. And what that's going to work on is the items that the president was focused on with Speaker Boehner. You're not going to reduce the deficit without tax reform, without entitlement reform.
So that committee could include revenue increases, the committee, not the trigger.
The committee
could consider revenue increases.
Any long-term deficit reduction, and I think the American people have spoken clearly about this too. If you're a middle-class family, if you're a senior citizen, you're furious that the answer to the deficit reduction by some here in Washington, mainly Republicans in the House, is to ask you to do everything. You're going to have closing of tax loopholes. You're going to have revenue produced to close the deficit. There is, without getting into details, obviously one of the things we've been focused on, and this was part of the president's deficit reduction plan he outlined way back in the spring, was an enforcement mechanism. So if this committee doesn't act, and I would start by saying I think it's incumbent on leaders in both parties to appoint people to this committee who are focused on deficit reduction, who will be willing to get out of their party's comfort zone so you can produce something that can get voted on. But an enforcement mechanism so that if the committee doesn't act, if it deadlocks, that there be some additional deficit reduction. And that's obviously one of the areas that's under discussion.
So do you now think, as this is being worked on, do you think after all this tension and stress between the parties that there will be something that both parties can get all their members, well, a majority to vote on?
Well, we still have some hard work to do, but it would be inconceivable that we don't. I think the American people, you flashed the stock market decline this week. It's clear that it's hurting consumer confidence, business confidence. We have to remove this specter. The debt ceiling's been raised dozens of times over the last couple decades. It has to be raised again. And again, let's remember what we're talking about here. These are bills that Congress already put on the credit card. They're required to pay for them. We all agree, and if you're an American citizen, you should be, I think, pleased by this. There's almost unanimity that we need to stop putting as much spending on the credit card. So the debate we're having right now is how do we reduce the deficit? So I think that all the leaders have said, both privately and publicly, that the United States of America is not going to default. So
will it happen by the deadline, though? By the August 2nd deadline?
Yeah, well, that is the deadline. Our borrowing authority runs out. And
no short-term extensions, a few days?
Well, what we've said, and I think someone in Congress has said, if you have a deal and you needed a day or two to dot the I's and cross the T's, but there's no reason to even do that. We have to get this done by Tuesday because it would be inconceivable for the United States of America, the impact that would have not only on people here in this country, most importantly, but around the world would be catastrophic.
But Dave, let me press you on the details here, because the details of this enforcement mechanism are all important. This is what the whole negotiation is coming down to right now. The president has said time and time again he wants a balanced approach that includes tax reform, revenue increases. Everyone I've talked to on Capitol Hill says this enforcement mechanism would not include revenue increases, would just be across-the-board spending cuts, domestic spending, Medicare perhaps, and defense, and it would not include revenues. So if the enforcement mechanism doesn't include revenues, what incentive would Republicans have to consider revenue increases, and wouldn't it all but guarantee that the final product is all spending cuts and not the balanced approach the president wants? Well,
I will. First of all, I think the committee is going to be charged with finding significant deficit reduction. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on that committee. Certainly the work the president did with the speaker and is going to inform that committee. I think the American people have spoken loudly and clearly. They want a balanced approach that asks something of everybody. Now, whatever enforcement mechanism is put in place has to be strong enough to compel action, whatever its composition. People shouldn't look at this enforcement mechanism, at least from our viewpoint, as, well, you should assume that's going to happen. Because what you want, and historically there have been enforcement mechanisms that have been strong enough to compel action. Back in 1990, the first President Bush reached agreement with Democratic leaders because there was a looming trigger that people wanted to make sure it didn't get pulled. But that included revenue increases. Well, now you're talking about one that does not include revenue increases. Isn't that the problem? Well, listen, we're talking about a variety of options here. But the key principle is that the enforcement mechanism has to be strong enough to compel both parties.
But let me just press this then. Can the president accept an enforcement mechanism that is spending cuts only, automatic spending cuts only, that does not include revenues?
What I would say is we would accept an enforcement mechanism that ensures that compels both parties to action. And also is something that we think substantively is acceptable to the country.
So you're saying there may be a way to compel action by both parties without including revenues?
Well, again, we're talking about a variety of different options here in the closing hours here about how to compel that action. I would say that the positive thing is I think both parties agree that you need such an action. And exactly what the composition is, again, we want to make sure that there's focus on this committee acting. And I think this has been a healthy debate. I think the American people understand a lot more about the deficit, about that there's no easy answers. I think it's been a healthy debate here in Washington. And I think any long-term deficit reduction is going to include revenues and smart entitlement reform.
Republicans don't agree with that.
Well, some Republicans do. First of all, I'd say most Republicans in America do. And you're beginning to see more Republican senators speak to this, listen, we had a deal with Speaker Boehner that obviously fell apart, that included $800 billion in revenue. So I'm confident that any solution that this committee would produce that ultimately would vote on in Congress is going to be a balanced.
Frustrated members of your own party, they're basically saying, look, why doesn't the president, who has his principles, stand up for them rather than spending so much time wanting to be bipartisan, a conciliator? I mean, they're saying the Republicans are driving a harder bargain. And as George has just described, the president has moved all the way to the language and the ideals that the Republicans espouse.
Now, if you look at
Yes, because he wanted a clean bill, then a bill with cuts and spendings, and now, as George is talking about, it's all cuts for the moment.
Well, first of all, we've been clear we need this debt ceiling increased well into the future. The spectacle in Washington this week, anyone who thinks we should repeat this again a few months down the road, I don't think there's many people in America. So first of all, we need a longer term extension because our economy cannot have this cloud over it. Secondly, deficit reduction now is going to happen in two stages. There's going to be a first stage that has cuts agreed to, largely that came out of the work the president and the vice president did, that are acceptable largely to members of both parties. The second stage is going to be a committee that's looking into the tougher issues of entitlement reform and tax reform. The president believes that we need to reduce the deficit. This isn't about playing on a Republican playing field. This country, our economy, has to reduce the deficit. We have to live within our means. And if you're a progressive, there's a powerful case for deficit reduction. Things like college loans, college scholarships, medical research, spending on things like roads and bridges that put construction workers to work. If we don't reduce the deficit in the not too distant future, we're not going to have room to do any of that. So we have to live within our means. And I think the president has been clear that he is willing to do some tough things because the only way to reduce the deficit is to get out of your comfort zone. You're not going to do it without some smart entitlement reform in the long term, but you're also not going to do it without significant tax reform.
You keep saying smart entitlement reform. Does that include Medicare cuts? Are Medicare cuts back on the table as part of this congressional committee's mandate and as part of the enforcement mechanism's mandate?
Well, again, there's various, George, enforcement mechanisms that would have different construct. In the initial set of spending cuts, obviously, these are just domestic spending cuts, and they would be both defense and non-defense. The committee's charge then, before we get the enforcement mechanism, will be how do you fill in the rest of the details. The truth is we will have cut a lot of domestic spending, so there's not going to be much more room there.
That drives you to Medicare and Medicaid, perhaps Social Security.
And tax reform. And the president was pretty clear. He laid out. He was willing to do Medicare reform. Our view on this is if we can strengthen Medicare, if we can strengthen Social Security, as opposed to what the House Republicans wanted to do, which was largely to dismantle it.
But you keep talking about tax reform, and what we've just seen in the House all week long is there are not votes in the House of Representatives. There's not a majority in the House of Representatives for the kind of package you're talking about.
Well, it's hard to get a majority of House Republicans, it seems, to even support their own plan. But here's what I'm convinced of. The shame of it is, if the quote-unquote grand bargain that the president had been working with the Speaker on, I'm convinced had that come, it would have been the easiest thing to get the votes for. Because it would have been deficit reduction on such a grand scale that even though there was component parts in it that are really tough political votes, people would have been willing to accept it. Well, now we're going to do it in two stages, but ultimately we need the same outcome, which is we need significant deficit reduction, $3–4 trillion over 10 years, really begin to reduce the deficit in the years after that, and it's got to be done in a balanced way.
You keep saying it has to be done. If it's not, what is the administration going to do? I mean, the specter of U.S. soldiers fighting for this country in Afghanistan, asking their commander whether they're going to get paid is really shameful.
Yes.
What are the choices that are going to be made if this doesn't come through as you hope?
Well, it's really unthinkable. And I think the specter you raised is one of the reasons I think there's so much urgency on Capitol Hill this morning.
Where are the tough choices in what's going to be paid?
Well, first of all, our focus now is on solving this. You know, we don't have much time left, a little over 60 hours, I guess. We've got to get this solved. And, you know, at the last hours, people are looking for off-ramps. There is no off-ramp here. The only option is for Congress to raise the debt ceiling and to sign these initial deficit reduction savings into law. Obviously, if Congress isn't able to act, the Treasury Department is going to have to brief people who'd be affected, and will obviously do that. But the focus now has to be driving towards some conclusion here. And listen, I think the American people are sitting at home and saying, you know, they've gone through this recession. Many have lost jobs. Many are working 2 jobs. They're helping family members who've been affected. They're furious at this. What they're screaming out, listen, the president a couple times this week talked about compromise. And Capitol Hill was besieged by tweets, by calls, by emails, because the American people are fed up. They want their leaders to lead, and part of leading is compromise. You know, George, you've worked on Capitol Hill. Any meaningful agreement has to be based on compromise, particularly when you have divided government. The American people chose divided government in 2010, but they did not choose dysfunctional government. And I think the spectacle this week has been something that's enraged Americans, and I think they're going to insist that their leaders here over the next 2.5 days solve this problem.
Well, we're certainly going to be watching it. David Plouffe, thank you very much indeed.